Elidor by Garner, 13th Silent Night. Next morning the static electricity had dispersed. The rose bed was normal. At this time of year it was dark when the children came home, and so the only chance Roland had of inspecting the garden was after breakfast. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday passed, and nothing happened. He tried to vary his approach so that no one would see what he was doing. He brought in coal or carried cinders out or threw scraps for the birds. He noticed that food landing near the bed was always the last to be taken, and the sparrows and starlings never gathered there to fight over a crust as they did in the rest of the garden. A single bird would dart in and snatch the food, and the quarreling would not begin until the bird was clear of the rose bed. On Thursday morning, Roland was having his breakfast when Mrs. Watson threw a piece of burnt toast out of the window. The toast fell on the path and lay untouched. Roland saw one bird fly down from a chimney, but when it was over the garden, it braked in the air, shot sideways, and flew back to the chimney, where it sat, ruffling its feathers and wagging its head. A few minutes later, it tried again with the same result. No other birds came near. As soon as he could, Roland went to the garden. There were plenty of birds in the orchard over the fence next door, but they were all silent. Roland crossed the path, nearly too late. He was doing something by looking at the shadows, and the whining noise was coming now. He forgot about proving himself right. It was too dangerous. He had to move while he could. Roland floundered across the garden, toward the house. His knees and the small of his back felt as though they were bubbles of air, and the ground was never where he thought it was. "Your tea is ready?" Mrs. Watson called when she heard Roland in the kitchen. "Thanks, Mum," he said. It was 8 o'clock before all the family was ready to watch the television. Mr. Watson had settled down about 10 minutes earlier, and so when Mrs. Watson and the children joined him, they were surprised to find that he had not switched the television on. "Is something wrong, Frank?" said Mrs. Watson. "No, I'm listening to the carol singers. They're the first this year." In the distance, they could hear uncertain treble voices. "Silent Night," said Mr. Watson, "my favorite." "I heard them 3 weeks ago," said Mrs. Watson. "They start earlier every year." "I suppose before long," said Mr. Watson, they'll run it in with Guy Fawkes Day and get all the collecting done at one go. "Are we having the telly on, Dad?" said Nicholas. "In a minute," said Mr. Watson. "In a minute. Let's be seasonable. It's not every night of the year you can hear carols, and we'll have to pay for them, so let's have our money's worth. They sound as though they're outside Mrs. Spilbury's. We should get them at the next move." But as he said this, they heard the scuffle of feet on the porch. "Oh, really," said Mr. Watson. "Already? It's a bit much to expect to be paid for something you can't hear. Go away. We want Silent Night outside the window before you have a penny." He winked at the others. "I'll complain to your union." There was a further scuffle. The doorknob rattled. "Young scamps," said Mr. Watson. "They might have the decency to knock. Go away, off with you." A pause. Then they heard footsteps on the pavement and a whispered muttering, and then, still whispered, "Ready? 1, 2, 3, and several voices in different keys began to sing away in a manger. Before they reached the end of the first line, there was a polite knock on the door. "That's more like it," said Mr. Watson, and opened the door. "Merry Christmas," said a small boy in the porch. He brandished a money box. "And a Happy New Year." "Now, why couldn't you do it properly the first time?" said Mr. Watson. "There was no need to rattle the door like that, and I did ask for Silent Night." The boy gaped at him. "What do you mean, mister? We've been up the road. No one rattled your door." "Come now, come," said Mr. Watson. "I distinctly heard you lurking about in my porch." "We never." "Thank you," said Mr. Watson. "We didn't." "I said thank you. Now listen, all I'm asking is that you sing what I requested, Silent Night, as you refrain from rattling my door. That's reasonable, isn't it?" "No one rattled your door, mister," said the boy. "We weren't anywhere near your door." And that is the end of chapter 13.